Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Starting verse 1 here, it says, "Who is as the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. Be not hasty to go out of his sight. Stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say unto him, What doest thou? Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment, because to every purpose there is a time and judgment. Therefore the misery of man is great upon him, for he knoweth not that which shall be, for who can tell him when it shall be? There is no man that hath power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, neither hath he power in the day of death, and there is no discharge in that war, neither shall wickedness deliver those that are given to it. All this have I seen and applied my heart unto every work that is done under the sun. There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. And so I saw the wicked buried, and who had come and gone from the place of the holy, and there were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This is also vanity. Because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God before him. But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. There is a vanity which is done upon the earth, that there be just men, unto whom it happeneth according to the work of the wicked. Again, there be wicked men, to whom it happeneth according to the work of the righteous. I said that this is also vanity. And then I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry, for that shall abide with him of his labor the days of his life, which God giveth him under the sun. When I applied mine heart to know wisdom, and to see the busyness that is done upon the earth, for also there is that neither day nor night seeth sleep with his eyes, then I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, because though a man labor to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, farther, though a wise man think to know it, yet shall he not be able to find it." Okay, so here we have in chapter 8, verse 1 kind of serves as the anchor for the whole chapter. And so verse 1, "Who is as the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing?" And then he says, "A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed." The boldness of his face, you can think of the hardness of somebody's face changing into, as he talks about his face is shining. So you can see kind of someone who's maybe looking, bold, angry, dejected, into somebody looking glad, joyous, happy, that kind of thing. And so verse 1, then Solomon espouses the benefits of wisdom, because it is something that makes his face to shine. And so when the Bible talks about this, for one's face to shine, it speaks of a couple of things. Somebody having favor upon them, their face is shining because they've been favored, but also of general happiness. And so this is what comes to those who not only seek but find wisdom. And so Solomon is showing us the benefits then of a wise man, or seeking wisdom, finding wisdom. And so this is, like I said, this becomes the anchor for chapter 8. And so the wise man then is one who understands his relationship to various things. First of all, being the king. Those are those who are in authority over that man. And so the wise man is the one who keeps the king's commandment and is faithful in his service to the king. And Solomon said he does this because this was his oath before God. Now, and you see that in verse 2. We do have a couple of examples in the Old Testament of those in Israel kind of making an oath to serve the king. We see one, I think it's 2 Samuel chapter 5, kind of when David is finally being made king over the whole kingdom. And there's these oaths that people make to follow the king. Now, we understand also in the Old Testament it was a little bit different, because the nation of Israel understood the king to be the means of God's providence for the nation, right? And that's exactly what the king was. That's what the king was supposed to be. Most of them failed in that greatly, but the king in Israel was supposed to be kind of this conduit of God's grace and goodness to Israel. And so there's a sense in which Solomon is referencing that, and the only reason I say that is his text here might be a little bit more authoritative than what we might expect in a New Testament context, but even as I say that, we still see that what he says here is really just as true, because we read in Romans 13:1, it says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." And so in the same sense then, you can see that it is the oath of a Christian to be faithful to God. I must be faithful to those who are in authority over me. However, the prevailing guidance for the Christian is not do what the government says. The prevailing guidance for Christians do what God says. Because, Peter was the one who said we ought to obey God rather than men. And that ought to be our guiding principle. And so when those who are in authority over us, whoever that may be, when those that are in authority over us give a rule or a law for us to follow, if that law is in keeping with the principles and precepts of Scripture, we are to follow that law. And we are to be law-abiding citizens insofar as it is in keeping with our Christian walk. But anything that the government or anybody else who's in authority, anything that they might impose upon us that would keep us either from doing that which we ought to do or try to make us do that which we ought not to do, either way, we don't do that. We follow God rather than men. And so we object to that kind of thing. But like I said, there is a sense in which the words in which Solomon speak here are just as true today as they were when he penned them. We might think, well, our government is so evil, our government is so wicked, and that is true. I'm not denying that. Hopefully, some things will change with that, but that is true. But you also have to understand the situation wherein Paul wrote Romans 13. Right? When Paul wrote Romans 13, we understand it was just as much a pagan, wicked, ungodly government to which Paul is writing, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. And so we understand that there's a great deal of wisdom here in what Solomon is saying, even still for us today. The wise man, right? Verse 1, the wise man understands his relationship to the king. The wise man understands his relationship in living life. And so the wise man not only knows how to obey authority, but he knows how to discern, this is verse 5, he knows how to discern both time and judgment. And so whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. Verse 6, because to every purpose there is time and judgment. Therefore the misery of a man is great upon him, for he knoweth not that which shall be, for who can tell him when it shall be. And so back in chapter 3, if you remember, chapter 3 is that famous portion, there's a time for everything, right? There's a time to live, time to die, time to weep, time to laugh, and he goes through all the things. And so Solomon tells us back in chapter 3 that there is an appropriate time for everything. There's an appropriate time for these things to take place. Here in chapter 8, he tells us that the wise man is the one who understands when it is appropriate to do those things. Right? So chapter 3 just says that there is a time when these things are appropriate. Here in chapter 8, Solomon says, but it takes wisdom to know when that appropriate time actually is. However, he goes on to say that the misery of man is that more often, well, maybe not more often, but oftentimes we don't know when the appropriate time is. And so that's verses 6 and 7, right? The great misery of man is great upon him. Why? Because he knoweth not what shall be. Right? Or at the end of verse 7, for who can tell him when it shall be? And so he goes on to talk about our death, because that's kind of the ultimate example of that, because we don't know when that's going to be. Nobody knows when that's going to be. And not only is it inevitable, but it is inescapable. He says quite pointedly there in verse 8, no man hath the power of the Spirit to retain the Spirit. I can't keep myself alive. He says, neither hath he power in the day of death, and there is no discharge in that war. There's no getting out of that, right? There's no conscientious objectors when it comes to death. There's no getting out of it. And he says, neither shall wickedness deliver those that are given to it. In other words, a lot of times people who do wicked acts because they believe it is going to, in some way, improve their life, right? They steal, they launder, they do whatever to get gain, so they think it will lead to a better life for them. And so he says, even though they're trying to better their lives, wickedness is not going to deliver them from death. The righteous man, the wicked man, doesn't matter. They both have their appointment with death. And so this thought, this understanding should all cause us to live more fervently for wisdom, because he says in verse 9 that there is a time where one man ruleth over another to his hurt. Now, it's debated as to what exactly he's talking about here, but I kind of fall in line with those who believe that Solomon is talking about executing wisdom in the right manner because people will follow a wise man. And when people are following a wise man, he holds a tremendous amount of sway over them. And so he says, there's a time when one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. You don't want to lead somebody to ruin, lead somebody to shame. You don't want to lead somebody into a bad situation because they were simply following what you said to do. And so knowing our choices could lead to the hurt of others should cause us to live in the fear of the Lord. And this is ultimately the point he's making. And the reason why I say that, even though it's not stated here, is because the fear of the Lord is where true wisdom originates. Right? And so you can kind of combine Ecclesiastes and Proverbs with that. Same author, and obviously Proverbs talks a deal about the origination of wisdom being the fear of the Lord. And so the next thing, the next topic he switches to is he kind of uses that topic of death that he just talked about and goes, there's a wisdom in death as well. And now, he compares the deaths of the wicked with the quote-unquote righteous, with those who fear the Lord. And so verse 10, he says, and I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This is also vanity. Essentially, he's saying, I see wicked people die. People go and they mourn their deaths, and then they leave, and they forget the wickedness that they've done. And you know, you've probably, perhaps you've been to funerals where you know, I don't mean to laugh. It's not a laughing matter. But the person who has died was genuinely a wicked individual, and yet everybody's telling all these good stories, and everybody's remembering all these good things, and then people leave the funeral, and all they're thinking about is, what a wonderful person this was, when in actuality that was not their life. And Solomon is talking about that. He says this is vanity. He says in verse 11, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set to do them evil, though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. Now, verse 11 is sort of a parenthetical thought that Solomon had in the midst of his argument here. He's talking about the death of the wicked, and then in verse 11 he kind of gives us an explanation. Here's sometimes why people are wicked, but also how they can continue to be wicked. And it's an interesting thing. I don't want to spend much time here, but he says, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. And so essentially he says they can keep on doing wicked things because they know they're going to get away with it. And I already referenced Romans 13, but Romans 13 the famous passage that talks about God giving powers of the sword to the government for the express purposes of putting down evil, right? One of the reasons why, as a Christian, I can be, a lot of times people say that this is a contradiction, but as a Christian, I can uphold fervently the values of a pro-life argument while at the same time being pro-death penalty. And people say, well, how can that be? Because I'm trying to protect the innocent, and I'm trying to destroy the wicked to protect more innocent, right? And so this is exactly why the government has been given those authorities by God. And verse 11 shows us what happens when they don't. And we're seeing this in our own society. People being able to do whatever they want to do and get away with it. Why do they do evil? Because the evil work is not executed speedily. They're allowed freedom to go out and do what they want to do. But nevertheless, verse 12, he gets to this point and he says, though a sinner do evil 100 times, but his days and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. And then he compares that to the righteous in verse 13. But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are the shadow, because he feareth not before God. And so verse 12 and 13 almost seem like they contradict one another. Because in verse 12 he says, a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged. But in verse 13 he says, but it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days. And so in verse 12 he's kind of referencing the person who does wicked in this life, and again kind of seems to get away with it. And whereas if justice was happening, they wouldn't have this long life. But you know, due to injustice they do. But then verse 13, he's not talking about human governments anymore. He's talking about God now. He's talking about the day of death and what comes after. He's not prolonging that. Right? His day of death is sealed by God. His eternity is sealed by God. He's not prolonging that by the wickedness he did on his earth. But who will prolong that? Those that fear God. Those that fear God. He says, I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. And so it is interesting here because Solomon, there's a handful of times before we get to kind of the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes, where Solomon fully pulls back the curtain. There have been a few times throughout the first, I think it's 10 and a half chapters or so, where Solomon kind of gives us a peek on the other side of the curtain, and this is one of them. And so Solomon pulls back the veil of that under-the-sun perspective to show that there truly is a beyond the sun, right? We've talked about this a little bit, that there is a beyond the sun, and in the reality of that, beyond the sun world, where God rules, the wicked are going to face judgment, right? And so he's been bringing forth all these questions from a secular perspective, which is, why does it seem like the wicked do all these things and get away with it? And he's been asking these questions, and he ultimately hasn't been giving any answers from an under-the-sun perspective. Well, here, just for a brief instance, what does he say? No, it's not going to be well for them. It's not going to be well for them. Why? Because they're not fearing God. And so it's almost as if Solomon just couldn't take it anymore, and he had to get just that little tidbit in there as he's writing through the book to give us an understanding that he knows what he's saying. He understands the reality of, again, from that beyond-the-sun perspective. And he's just been writing this, I do believe, from personal experience, as he writes about a time wherein he lived really apostate, you could say, away from God. And so it stands as a warning. We've talked about all that. And so he finishes the chapter, again, similar to what we saw not that long ago, almost pessimistic a little bit, not to the extent that he did in the last chapter. But verse 14, there is a vanity which is done upon the earth, that there be just men, unto whom it happeneth according to the work of the wicked. And then the same in reverse, wicked men happening according to the righteous. He said, I said that this also is vanity. And so verse 15 is kind of his conclusion of that. He said, then I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry. For that shall abide with him of his labor the days of his life, which God giveth him under the sun. And so Solomon sees this great injustice in the world, which is sometimes things don't look any different between the wicked and the just. All right? Sometimes you could take the life of a wicked person, the life of a just person, and you can say things kind of look too similar for us to be comfortable with this idea that God's going to bless the just and condemn the wicked. And so Solomon is looking at this, and he comes to these same uncomfortable conclusions, I guess you could say, because we'd like to think that it's not that way, but often it is. And part of the reason for that is kind of what we've been talking about on our Sunday mornings, is that sometimes God's will is for us to suffer. Sometimes it is God's will for us to endure hard times and difficulty and trial. Now, sometimes that's a result of our own sin, and sometimes it's hard to know when it is, which it is. But to this, Solomon says, I commend mirth. Just be happy with what you have. And essentially what he's saying is, just focus on you. Don't focus on everybody else. Focus on you. Be happy. Don't really care about others, what they're doing. Just focus on you, because that's kind of the highest wisdom for those living under the sun. Now, that's not truly a Christian perspective. A Christian perspective is we are to care for others. And we are to look at the injustices in the world and speak out against them and do what we can to help those things. And so this isn't technically the Christian perspective, but he gives us a clue here, because twice in verse 15 he says, under the sun. All right, then I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun. And then at the end of the verse he says, which God hath given him under the sun. And so verse 15 is he's given us a double clue almost, that he's saying this is the best. This is the best that world has to offer. The best that world under the sun has to offer is just be happy with what you have and don't care about anybody else. And a lot of people might say, well, that sounds like a good life. Well, the answer to that is, when you understand that there is more than under the sun, you understand how well, to use his word, how vain of a life that truly is. And so this kind of a mindset, and here's where Solomon comes back into play here, verse 16. This kind of a mindset will never satisfy those looking for the great answers of life. And so when you think about all the philosophers and all the greatest thinkers that have ever lived, they're not going to be satisfied with that kind of an understanding. And so when I applied mine heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done upon the earth, go to verse 17, then I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. And so he said, again, still, I was just trying to figure all this out, and I just couldn't do it. And it frustrated me. That's kind of the point he's coming to. Because even the wisest must come to the conclusion that they're never going to know it all. Right? They're never going to figure all of this out, which honestly is a good argument for those who try to make a intelligent argument for either atheism or agnosticism, which is that's a very, very prideful and arrogant claim. Because for you to make the claim, particularly atheism, for you to make the claim that there is no God, you must be making the claim that you have such an understanding of the fullness of the universe that you have come to the conclusion that there cannot be a God because I have not contemplated it, I have not seen it, I have not studied it, and if I haven't seen it, studied it, contemplated it, it can't be true. That's a really arrogant and prideful argument. But ultimately, this is kind of the same thing that Solomon is talking about, that same kind of argumentation. I'm trying to study all the world, but he says, I beheld all the work of God, and a man cannot find it out. It can't figure it all out. Now, this, again, maybe sounds a little cynical, but honestly, I'll quote Kidner here at the end, it leaves us on a good note. And I'll just let Kidner say it. He says, although as time dwellers, we see God's work in tantalizing flashes, the very fact that we can ask about the whole design and long to see it is evidence that we are not entirely prisoners of our world. In more promising words, it is evidence of not only how, but for whom we have been made. In other words, the animal kingdom is not asking these questions. The animal kingdom is not looking around at the world and wondering what their place in it is. Right? They're not looking around the world and thinking about how they were created. What is their purpose in life? Is there life after their death? Right? The animal kingdom, it functions on instinct and their drive to eat and to survive the next day. As humans made in the image of God, we have something more. We have the same instincts at times, the same drives at times, but we have so much more is that we can contemplate what comes after. What is? Why are we here? Where did we come from? We have this innate desire to know these things, and that innate desire to know these things is it's not but it is an evidence that there is a creator who has put within us this instinct to know. And why? Because it ultimately, if we take those conclusions to their end, it drives us back to him. And so that in and of itself is an argument for God, for his existence, and for the fact that we need to be in right relationship with him. And so whereas it may seem a little cynical, like I said, it ends really on a positive note. And so here we are making our way quickly through the book of Ecclesiastes. We've only got 4 chapters left. And Solomon is quickly going to wrap up these experimental questions, and he's going to come to some conclusions that will be interesting to see. All right.